Chris, welcome to Stories in AI. How are you today?
I'm fantastic, Ganesh, and really a pleasure to be on the show and speak to you today.
No, it's amazing. Thank you for taking the time, and it's pretty exciting, and it's great to actually have someone who's familiar with the show, who's been listening to the show as well. So great to have you here as a guest. Why don't we get started with your background? We'll dive right in right after.
100%. So, like many of the guests on your show, and no doubt some of the listeners as well, I come from a product management background. And actually, prior to joining Experian, I worked about 15 years in telecommunications, and
Mm,
I was helping very large organizations across the globe undertake their digital transformation. And actually, the technologies that I was working on as a product manager are many of the same technologies which really came to the fore during this COVID period. Things
mm,
like remote video collaboration, technologies using the cloud, software as a service, basically the kind of distant ancestors of the Zoom and Microsoft Teams that we're all using today. And so we were building these, we were integrating them into our networks. We were helping the heads of these large organizations get their heads around what did cloud mean for their business? What does it mean to follow a software as a service type commercial model? And how do you securely provide access to your employees? And I think most interestingly for me was that we already had this early idea of hybrid worker. Over
hmm
10 years ago, and we were already grappling with this concept of what would it be like if your staff were only in the office 2 or 3 days a week. And it's funny to me because at the time that concept was incredibly avant-garde.
Yeah,
A lot of
yeah.
business leaders thought you were crazy if you were imagining a world in which your employees were only visible at their desks 2 or 3 days a week. And sure, there's still a debate going on right now, and every day you can look on LinkedIn and someone's weighing in on this discussion. But I feel it's a much more mainstream, normalized concept than it was 10 years ago when we were talking about it.
No, I agree with you, Chris. And first off, I think some of those software that you actually called out, like Teams and Skype, not so distant ancestors. It still sucks, but all the others, I get it. No, and it's so fascinating. I do have some background during my days at Dell. I spent a lot of time with the telco community at that time. And it was always fascinating for me because there was a lot of forward thinkingness because it was such a core infrastructure play if you're in telcos and infrastructure kind of projects. And you had to really think through how things are going to evolve over time. But obviously, nobody really predicted how quickly that switch got turned on because of COVID. The last part that you said, however, Chris, is interesting because, you know, I think there is still a growing divide in people believing in true hybrid work versus,
Mm.
yeah, it's never going to be productive. People are just like, there's a lot of folks, a lot of founders I know, Elon Musk, everybody who's complaining that, hey, this whole complete hybrid remote work, not being in the office is not going to work long term. We got to come back to being in the office. I know, like a lot of companies like Experian, Dell. My wife works at Dell, and then they're very much embracing off the remote culture, saying we understand that the world is going to be hybrid, and we have to enable our employees and partners to be as productive and as happy as wherever they are. Right? Um,
A
it's pretty awesome.
100%. And I think my experience of seeing this employed across a whole range of different industries and across a whole range of different countries. So, as
Mm,
part of my role, I actually lived out in Hong Kong for 6 years, and I traveled to the Middle East, I traveled to South Africa, and so on. And so I've seen the success of hybrid work really depends on aspects such as the local culture, the culture of
mm,
the organization, and also the kind of job you're doing. And it's been funny over the
so
last few
true.
months that people have come back into the office. Many are actually delighted to see their colleagues again and delighted to get into a meeting room and write on a whiteboard and go for a coffee afterwards. And these are kind of human engagements which are very exciting to people. And so there's definitely a value in that, and in some roles that's more important than in others.
Yeah.
But I feel like the balance is something that more and more large organizations are kind of seeking to achieve now, and it's more inclusive as well, in terms of enabling diversity. There's definitely an element of that in hybrid work.
No, totally agree. And I think it was Walter Isaacson who said, right, humans are hardwired for collaboration. and
Mm.
which actually opens up the opportunity on the one hand, saying remote tools, all the technology today is still not really going to replace that whole thing, which is a huge opportunity. The metaverse, crypto, Web3 kind of folks who are working on it. But on the other hand, it kind of emphasizes the need for human connection and making that a part of your fabric, right? So you might have the best technology, but you got to embrace that. Okay, why don't we dive into, first tell us about your role at Experian, right? What do you do on a day-to-day
Sure.
basis? Yeah.
Absolutely. So I'll talk you through what my role, my title is, and then I'll explain what that means because I know that titles can be something difficult to decipher.
Yeah.
So I'm the Vice President of Portfolio Strategy within Decisioning in Experian. So to
Hmm.
explain what that means, I'm really interested in how data and analytics software helps businesses make credit risk decisions. And I'll give you a kind of specific example that hopefully your listeners will understand. So imagine you go to apply for a loan from your bank. What they
Yeah.
would do is using Experian software or an equivalent. Firstly, they would determine that you are who you say you are.
Hmm.
Second, they would pull up some data, your credit history, and a score that would represent your ability to pay this loan off. Then
Hmm.
they would use a series of rules, which we call a strategy. But if we're thinking kind of AI data scientists, as many of your audience are, we might just call it a model. But we'd use this model to decide whether to approve your application. We could approve it, we could refuse it, or it could be referred to an underwriter for a manual inspection. And so this process that we call decisioning kind of sits at the heart of kind of credit risk analysis, credit provision. It's being used all around the world. It's being used in financial services, obviously. It's heavily used in telecommunications, insurance, automotive. Anywhere where credit is being provided, someone's having to make a decision and they're using data and analytics and software, possibly experience, to make that kind of decision. And in terms of my role as sort of responsible for strategy globally, I'm looking across the technology trends, the business trends, the consumer trends in this space, and I'm trying to
Hmm.
anticipate what does this all mean, where is it going, and I have this voracious appetite for data and insights to help me to be a little bit predictive on there and to ultimately make recommendations to the Experian business on where we employ our limited resources. So there's a little bit of uh, understanding this data, making sense of this data, and ultimately doing the right thing to help our customers who are predominantly large financial services, automotive, telecommunications, but also kind of our Experian values around helping consumers to
Yep.
not take on credit that's not affordable to them and to protect them and so on. And so just on this sort of this process I described, this kind of loan process, there's sort of a number of things. We're all consumers, right? We all are using credit cards and things on a daily basis. What would you want from that process? You want
Hmm.
it to be seamless. Okay, don't ask me for 100 pieces of information. Please do not ask me to go to my local branch with a copy of my passport and my driving license and my birth certificate in order to apply for credit. Don't ask me those things because I don't want to do that.
Yeah.
And we laugh about it, but there are some organizations that are still doing that today. There are some
Oh,
organizations
believe
that
me.
are
Yeah.
relying on manual processes and using Excel spreadsheets and other such tools rather than automating and using AI. So that's a kind of real situation. I've had a high street bank actually tell me, "Can you come into a branch and do this process?" So that's kind of the consumer side. Then on the business side, what do you want? You want to minimize risk, of course. Absolutely crucial. You minimize risk. But you also want to minimize your cost as well. So you don't want to have lots of manual referrals. You don't want to have to involve a significant number of underwriters if you can simplify it. You
Hmm.
don't you want to have a branch on every single street corner just for this loans process if you don't need to, if that's not how consumers want to engage, because that's a very expensive thing to do. So these are all the kind of dimensions that I'm looking at as part of my role, and I'm saying, okay, how do we need to change our product? How do we need to change the way that we do things, our ways of working, to represent the way this is going in this kind of post-COVID period?
Interesting. That's a first off, congrats. That's an amazing role. Sounds like you're having so much fun. It's very evident you're passionate about it. The two things I couldn't help, I identify with was one was you had kind of a dual responsibility or dual thing, where one, you're actually trying to help consumers and businesses trying to actually just be competitive in this landscape in the area of lending, in the area of credit risk, and so
Hmm.
forth. But on the other hand, you're also a practitioner of data and analytics by looking at this universe of data and the trends that are happening across the world to see what do I need to go act on, what is signal versus noise, how do I actually do it. And it's very fascinating, right? Because when you're in a and that's the opportunity when you are in a larger organization like Experian, where you get to do both. Whereas if you're in a smaller company, you're probably just focused on building for the customer and not so much having a broader view of the market in general. So, let me ask you, what do you see from your vantage point when you look at the market? What do you see in that's happening that's good versus bad, right? Give me a landscape.
Hmm. Sure, absolutely. And I guess what I'll do is I'll start by talking about this very specific credit risk space in
Sure.
which I'm, doing my living my daily life, and then we can talk more broadly about AI, machine learning, and some of the
Perfect.
exciting trends and so on. I mean, I guess just to come back to that loan approval process we just talked about. As I said, many organizations today are still relying on manual processes.
Mm,
And genuinely, there was a provider I spoke to who still use spreadsheets. Okay, so this is very real. Now, even for those who are employing software such as Experience to automate this process, when it comes to the actual models, which we call strategies, that
mhm.
decide whether or not you're approved, these are typically handcrafted by experts based on a range of different criteria. So, creating a scorecard of details against which you're referred. So these kind of traditional custom models are slow, they're resource intensive to develop and deploy, and often they're kind of outdated when they've even been launched. Take the last 2 years of the COVID period. Now we're going through a cost of living crisis in many economies, and potentially a recession as well. So you kind of handcraft these models based on the situation that we have today, based on the mind of the person who's doing it, very very skilled, very very well trained, but
Yep.
then you constantly have to change these models. Okay, so to address these needs, basically businesses want to develop and deploy these models in a very agile way and at low cost. And what we do is we have an analytics platform that helps us to do that. So we have an anonymized sandbox based on our bureau data. So all of the data in the US, which is anonymized, and you can, using our AI models, you can build your strategy and you can test it against the market in anonymized fashion. Okay, so you can see how this would perform in the
Yep.
UK, in the US, for instance. And so it's incredibly powerful to start building your models and your strategies using AI, using a kind of champion challenger methodology to see, is it
Yep.
better than what we handcrafted, and then to constantly refresh to outperform the way that you are today. And so that is incredibly exciting for me.
Awesome.
For many of the AI practitioners who are kind of listeners on your call, that might seem quite a basic case. But the reality is, I want you to all to imagine a very large financial services organization. They will have a huge legacy of tech, a huge tech debt. Imagine a room full
Yep.
of kind of spaghetti wires of old on-premise mainframe machines. Many of these are currently controlling how credit decisions are being made today. Some of which are decades old. And to move from that to a kind of modern cloud architecture, API driven, harnessing machine learning, harnessing kind of closed loop algorithms and so on, is a huge step for these organizations. And they have massive technology barriers. They have human cultural barriers as well to overcome to do that. So there's a huge amount of power in offering this kind of solution, this end-to-end platform approach using AI, but also the barriers, the level of effort, the inertia that has to be overcome by these large financial services, telcos, etc., to actually embrace that future is, it's a lot of work to be done.
That is awesome. No, it's fascinating how there you covered both sides of it, right? the even touched upon the technical challenges of actually how do you actually deal with it. And I've actually I think I've met someone who used your, I think it's called the Ascend sandbox to actually
Yes,
play
that's
with
right.
this particular thing, and they were actually telling me it really would help them a lot, just trying to get some uh, like you said, the champion challenger model to a test out, saying, oh, let me just get a baseline of how performance is for these models and so forth. So it's interesting. Now, you guys do global insights report every quarter or every year. I've been following it. I've tweeted about it a few times because I really felt it was a really good broad purview of the market, everything from consumer sentiment to how businesses are actually looking at it. So you get both sides of the spectrum, and then with layered on with a very technology bent to it, like AI and analytics and so forth. So you're, I think the last one came out in April or May or something. So what are
Mm.
some of the things? And I know you're very closely tied to the ads that we were talking about it earlier. So talk to me about the talk to us about the key insights that came out of that report. What are the big themes that you're seeing in the market?
Sure, absolutely, and I think before I jump into the detail, just caveat. So this is based on 6,000 consumers and 2,000 businesses from 20 countries worldwide. So there's a lot of richness,
And
regional
diversity.
difference between,
Yeah.
but yeah, diversity between different markets. But as I mentioned earlier, I've got this voracious appetite for data and insight. So for me, this was kind of gold dust, and I was going around everyone in my team saying, "Come on, guys, we got to act on this. Is fantastic." But yeah, so basically, the survey was taken in April. If you look at the kind of global situation at the time, I think the number of COVID cases was about half of the peak. So you might say it was premature to call this kind of post-COVID, but I would argue that from a lifestyle and attitude perspective for consumers, it kind of represents a new normal for them. Okay.
Yep.
So I guess to start with the things that were kind of not surprising, right? I mean, first of all, significant increases in digital spend from consumers, you know, retail shopping, etc. 53% said that they'd increase their online spend. Another
Wow.
50% said that they plan to increase it further in the next 3 months. And so, not surprising, continuation of what we saw in COVID, and in
Hmm.
fact, what we were seeing before COVID, but fundamentally, online retail is here to stay, online transactions here to stay, and across all ages, basically, huge intention to spend more online going forward. Um, and related to that was this interesting thread about experiences. And so, there was a number of interviewees said that a positive online experience made them more loyal to the brand. Okay. Now, again, reflect on these large financial services organizations with their huge legacy, the spaghetti of technology in the back room, and they are now competing in this new space against neobanks, against fintechs, against buy now pay later providers who are digital native, have none of the kind of technology baggage. They've been able to employ the best practice around agile, around uh, client discovery, all
Yep.
these kind of methodologies, working in a collaborative fashion online. And so, as a large financial service provider, you're going up against these guys, and now the people you're trying to sell to, these consumers, are saying, most important thing to me is a great online experience, and I will choose providers whose online is better. Okay, so that's
Sure.
very worrying for the kind of the traditional provider, these large banks and others.
So that's
And
awesome. And a couple of things, right? One is definitely I think we're now in a world where we use the phrase post-COVID, right? But it's this was COVID just was the acceleration, but we have seen this trend of actually going more digital, driving more interactions in an omni-channel, multi-channel fashion across not just physical stores but online experiences. But I think what COVID definitely did was flip the switch and saying what becomes your primary way of interacting with the customer if you're a business, and for a customer if you're interacting with a business, right? So definitely, we used to joke that your website is your storefront, right? But it's more than just the storefront right now. It's your back office, it's everything. It's integrated in providing that as a service model from soup to nuts for customers and consumers. I think a few things that you said was interesting, and definitely the explosion of fintech, crypto
Mm,
oriented tokenized players, and there's DeFi, decentralized finance. There's a lot of things that are happening in the market. This week is, I live in Austin, Texas, and this week is Consensus 2022, which is happening in person. So right after this call, I'm heading downtown to do some meetings. But it's just fascinating to see the explosion, because I mean, fundamentally, if we think about it, there's probably three things that human beings really care about, right? Health, wealth, and happiness, right?
mm,
Or commerce. You can say when commerce gives you happiness, right? But I think and financial wellness is such a huge topic, and it's just emerging out to be like everything that's happening in the world, the inequalities and stuff. So it's becoming front and center, and the technology building blocks now exist to enable these really amazing business models, right? I mean, buy now pay later. I'm just fascinated by everybody's doing that right now, and it's in fact
mm.
like if you're a Klarna or somebody, you're providing that as a service to anybody who wants to do it, right? So it's just fascinating from that perspective. Now, how has the consumer sentiment changed in terms of how they? I mean, is everybody like digital native versus a regular bank? Are the trust levels for the consumer the same? Do they trust both the businesses, both kinds of businesses? What do you see there?
So this is the really interesting thing now. So actually, what we've started to see and what's revealed within the survey results is that these digital natives and mobile wallet providers, etc., are now rivaling traditional credit cards.
Hmm.
And so we saw
Yeah.
sort of trust for mobile wallets, credit cards, and direct debit payment providers broadly in line with one another, and pretty much across all different age groups. So this is a huge upending of the kind of status quo within financial services. I grew up in the UK, and for us, banks are the large stone building in the center of your town with Corinthian columns that's been there for 100 years, and kind of is a symbol of stability and to a
Mhm.
certain extent trust. Now you have these entrants, some of which are less than 10 years old in being established, whose existence is an app on your mobile device, whose
Mhm.
brand is relatively new, and yet our survey, our insights is telling us that these are trusted and that these are, the primary way that consumers would like to engage with commerce and e-commerce particularly, and to pay for services. And so that's an incredibly exciting change in the market. Obviously, if you're in a traditional financial service provider, you're looking at, do we partner? Do we build our
Sure.
own neobank offshoot, or is there some other strategy we need to engage? But very interesting, the level of trust that consumers have for these new players has moved so quickly over COVID.
No, interestingly, that's very well put, Chris. I think what we're also seeing is like broadly outside of the financial services world or stuff like just working with AI, right? Right now, you're interacting with. I mean, AI from a technology standpoint is fast evolving as a computational platform, right? It's not
Hmm.
just the one little offshoot thing in there, but most decisions, the default mode is actually just have a decisioning system, an automated decisioning system, surface the insights from the data and so forth, right? What that does is actually the Hollywood narratives get screen time and newsworthy articles around it, but the reality is people's trust on automated decisioning systems are getting better.
Mm.
Because like do I am I going to be discriminated against this? There's enough bad news that comes out, but I think the general level of trust is also coming up from that perspective. So it's fascinating time to be alive, right? I mean, I think it's funny. I mean, we think about generational changes, right? So our kids, when they grow up, and they're like, what is trust? I mean, I thought this is the only thing I can trust, right? There's no, should I trust the human being behind it versus an algorithm telling me what to do? I'm like, it's the default is the algorithm. And should I trust the human being behind it? Is a bigger question that's going to come up, right? So this is fascinating. This is fascinating. The one last thing I want to actually touch upon in our conversation is, I like to think of this as like, just to close out on trust. I think trust, I think,
Mm.
is the new currency for
Mm,
digital interactions, right? It's very evident that one of my portfolio companies, Credo AI, they actually do responsible AI platforms to help you audit and ensure your AI systems are doing the right thing. What we're realizing is it's more than the technical aspect of things, because you mentioned businesses wants to manage risk. So one
mm,
is reputational risk, financial risk, forward performance risk, and so forth. But the things like reputational risk, things like not wanting to go and testify in front of the Senate if for doing something that your algorithm did that you weren't really having a thing on. So what the one trend that we're seeing, and I wanted to ask you whether you're seeing that too, and even Experian did this, is forward-leaning organizations are just saying, "Hey, let me tell you what we do with your data. Let me tell you
mm.
how we make decisions, right? Here's a framework. I'm pretty much giving you my playbook on what I'm doing with this, my treatment of the data, the handling of the data, and so forth." You think that's a trend that's here to stay, and even smaller players will have to just adapt to that?
100%, 100%. So in this report, we talk about the sort of new digital consumer, or sometimes the savvy consumer, and these are consumers who are increasingly aware of the value of their data.
Mm,
And so basically, I sort of see three scenarios. You're using my data. Why are you using it? Are you using it to provide the product? Such as like a maps type service, a location type service.
yeah.
Are you using my data to improve your product? And if you listen to kind of modern product management methodologies, they say that we should constantly be collecting data about how our products are being used in order to make them more aligned to the needs of the customer. Or is my data actually the product? So, for example, in advertising and other type
Hmm.
services. And in any of those instances, I want to feel that the value exchange of me giving you my data, I'm
Yeah,
getting something in return. I'm getting something in
sure.
return. And so, what is that something? Am I getting security? Am I getting convenience? Am I getting additional personalization? Or am I getting, the ability to communicate with friends via a social media network or so on? But I want to know exactly what the data is that you're collecting about me. I would like to decide how and when it's employed, um, and I want to have the option to opt out of those. And
Sure.
so, like the most notable example from recent years was the Apple iOS, I think 14.5, where now users of that iOS have the
Default.
option
Yeah,
to decide how and when applications are consuming their data and what forms of data they're consuming. And obviously, this is
I think
a
it's
big
brilliant.
disruptive effect on many different organizations' business models, who are using
Facebook.
your ability to browse from their app
Yeah.
in order to collect data and use it. And so I think we're going into a new era of transparency, where consumers will choose providers that tell them how their data is going to be used and give them a choice. And those that do not give that level of transparency will not be trusted. And if the value exchange is one where I feel that what I'm giving you is more valuable than what you're giving me in your app, then I'm going to walk away from it. And so it's a big challenge. It's going to be a big challenge, a big opportunity for organizations to respond to, but I don't think we can turn the clock back from here. I
Yeah.
think the sort of education of consumers is something that is important, that all organizations should be engaging in, and they should be adapting their business models accordingly.
No, you that more golden words that you got to pay attention to, because I think it's so wonderful that you actually phrased it that way. We are entering into this world where consumers wouldn't want to have control over not just their data, but no, they may not really care about having and keeping those data, but they want to know and control how that data is used and what kind of value exchange happens mutually in the process, right? The only thing that comes to mind is there's all this, so like I'm long crypto, so I believe in the future. There's a lot of equitable solutions you can drive in the world, financial inclusion, including with crypto and tokenomics in general. But the very interesting comment, I think, I don't know, forget who it was, tweeted that, I think it was Aaron Oren Hoffman. He was like, look, the fact that there is money embedded into a transaction in crypto and tokenomics, is that a feature or a bug? Because what you're not used to right now is, like, imagine like the casual conversation or the interaction now becomes having some kind of a monetary value associated with it. I mean, you don't really can't call it monetary, but some kind of tokenized value associated with it. So is that going to change the nature of the interaction, change the nature of people behavior with those interactions? So we're definitely entering into exciting worlds, but definitely I love what you said, right? We are entering this new digital post-COVID era where people will want to know how they want to have control over how their data is used and what they get in return, right? Chris, this
100%,
is
100%.
amazing. What's your, I would say, give me a top three advice for organizations looking at deploying AI and analytics to go transform or drive their digital transformation.
Sure. I mean, I might turn this around and ask you a question actually, because I've got my views, but I'm keen based on the amazing number of interviews you've done and engagements you've done with the AI community. So, one of the biggest challenges that I constantly hear from customers is with regards to successful deployment of AI.
Hmm.
Okay, so there's billions of dollars being spent in this exciting new burgeoning market and innovation around machine learning.
Yeah.
And yet we know from a range of different research reports, Gartner, MIT Sloan, writers like Thomas Davenport, that less than 20% of models are being put into production.
Yeah.
And so what you're seeing there, at least in 2022, is a poor return on investment for business, right? At least where we are right
That's so
now on
true.
the kind of hype cycle. So I'm keen. My advice or my sort of challenge to business leaders and to listeners would be uh, reflecting on why that is the case, recognizing the power of data, which I think all of your listeners will believe in, and the power of this technology. How do we actually deliver successful business outcomes and return on investment on those? So I'm keen for your reflections
You
first and
know,
foremost.
that's a first off. Again, you phrased it really well. The challenge around this, but I think I believe my personal view, and informed definitely by all the conversations I've had, is I think we're slightly looking at this a little differently. We're still like
Mm,
in the grand scheme of things with AI, we are still very, very early, right? So I agree. I mean, there is a lot of hype that it's in any particular thing, like internet, pet.com versus, all those things that happened before real value started coming in. AI is, been around for a long time, but the like deep learning was invented 3 years ago, 2 years ago, right? The first paper was 2018. So we're not that far along in that journey to start seeing this as an everyday thing. So that said, I think there is a positioning problem in how the expectations setting problem in how businesses look at AI. You can AI is definitely a piece of technology. It's a tool like any other piece of technology that gives you the opportunity to leap, you know, exponentially ahead of competition or be left behind if you don't adapt it, right? So the premise is actually true. It's very powerful. It can provide you advantages that you didn't have before. Just at a human level, our brains haven't evolved in the same whatever 100 years, 200,000 years that we've been around. um, the world around us has changed. The amount of data we produce is just impossible for us to comprehend everything, right? But that said, I think we're slightly looking at this the right way, right? The most successful organizations that have put AI to work and made a difference to them, they look at it slightly differently. And the one way they look at it is say they look at this as a capability enhancement opportunity, right? Meaning it's not
mm,
about buying a SaaS based AI product and making a difference to the business. That'll happen eventually. But AI brings in what you said earlier, the fundamentals of experimentation, being able to ask questions of the data, iteratively find out and get AI is not a deterministic science, right? In general, it is mostly probabilistic in nature. So you have to give time for that iteration. What you can do, and the successful organizations, what they did was build capability, in-house engineers, people, team processes, the whole nine yards. So that's one. So to me, that is there's an amazing podcast that I had with Daniel Fagella of. He actually runs a business AI in business podcast, which is another very popular podcast. So he was on my show launching it like right after our call, right after this recording. But and he talks about this thing saying, I think you should look at that capability spectrum as a return that you're getting out of the efforts in there. The second thing is you have to look at this and say, what's your appetite for doing something with this? If your
Mm,
industry is getting disrupted right away and you have to go make this happen, you have to look at it and say, am I going to make those high risk, high return kind of bets where, like, I'll try five things and four and a half of them will fail, and the other half that actually survives is not going to look anything like, we started off with, right? So when you have that setting in mind, then you're actually trying to do moonshots and stuff like that. And a lot of companies who actually went into it, organizations that went into it, are saying, we're going to try this. If it doesn't work, we're going to learn from it. We're going to build capability, and we'll try this, right? So they're very clear thing. That means you're allocating, I don't know, 5% of your R&D spend or 10% of your R&D spend, and not like betting the farm on AI and stuff. And then there is other industries which are more mature, which, and AI is also the thing that, it's, as I said, technology. The bigger question is, do you have deep understanding of your business? And if you have the deep understanding of your business, AI provides you tools to automate it, to expand the horizons of people, augment people and doing that and so forth. So there are the third camp of customers who are trying this and say, look, we very well understand our process. So we're not going to try to go make it and do press releases and have AI on every third word that my CEO speaks in a conference. But we're going to just go focus on the fundamentals. Look at low hanging fruits. Start solving problems that, hey, there is an invoice processing process that I'm actually in my business process. Exceptions cost me $20 million a year. Great. Can I just reduce that exceptions from, the cost of that exception, cut the number by half and get to $10 million a year to manage exceptions? That's a win for me, right? I'm not going to try to go do the moonshot. And the real winners out there are constantly experimenting across all the three spectrum, right? Building capability, going for moonshots, and then number three, definitely focusing on the fundamentals, which is what you said, right? Get
mm.
to outcomes, deliver value, make a case, and so forth. But I think we're well past the era of having to want to educate everybody on what AI can do. Everybody knows that. Now is a time for positive and quicker value realization. And I think there is a lot of great lessons out there, and like a lot of guests who came on Stories in AI talked about what they did to actually see it, right? And the common themes are things like, make sure everybody's bought in. There's a lot of buy-in across all levels of the organization, and there's a very realistic expectation of what to expect. You're not going to change things overnight and all that kind of stuff. And then you start small. You think big, you start small, and move really, really fast, right? That's a common theme I see. But no, it's fascinating, and you guys are doing an amazing job. From my conversation with Shri and Charles and some of the folks that I've actually interacted with at Experian, it's an amazing. You guys are doing an amazing piece of work, and you're right now in this place where, like, I mean, financial services is like as an evergreen industry, just like healthcare, right? And you have an amazing opportunity, and you're definitely as Experian taking advantage of it, which is not just give value to businesses, but also in the process empower the consumer, empower the actual end user. So, congratulations on all
100%.
the great work you guys do.
Thank
Yeah.
you. And just to say as well, like in terms of how I kind of look at this deployment challenge, right? The deployment
Mhm.
challenge of AI. Following on from what you said, I sort of see two dimensions to it. There's one dimension that Experian can help with, and there's another dimension that we can't. The dimension we can help with is addressing these challenges businesses have around the model performance. The one that they've built with AI is not strong enough. Okay, so we have, I mentioned the Ascend platform. We talked about the Power Curve decisioning platform. We can certainly help if your models are not strong enough.
Mhm.
Equally, if you're having technical hurdles in implementing your models or scores, actually driving them into production, we basically with our platform play as a one-stop shop can simplify that process and make that easier. What we cannot solve, and you kind of alluded to as well, are ultimately the kind of other big problem that businesses face, which is cultural issues in terms of actually approving the change, operationalizing, putting their trust in an AI model. Now we have a number of white papers and sort of thoughts around employing
Yeah.
this kind of culture of change, but it's up to every business to identify what their objectives are, exactly as you said, and to empower their people, recruit the right people and empower them to make those objectives come true. And so that's beyond the remit of what we do as a service provider, but is crucial to your success in employing AI.
That's amazing, Chris. That was an amazing. This was an amazing conversation. Thank you so much. Where can the viewers and listeners find you on the internet?
Sure. So, so I'm available on LinkedIn, and also you'll see my blogs come up from time to time on Experian.com.
Got it.
Yeah, and looking forward to any future feedback from your listeners. As I said, I'm an avid listener myself, so just excited to be part of this ecosystem of people talking about AI and looking to practical ways that we can use it to deliver value in the marketplace. So thank you
No,
so much for your time, Ganesh. It's been a great conversation.
thank you. My pleasure. And Chris, thank you for being a listener and a supporter of the podcast. And I'm sure the viewers, and I will add your contact details on the show notes. And I'll ask everybody to refer to this podcast that you listen to it. And then sure, Chris will actually respond to you when you send him a note. All right. So thanks so much for
Definitely.
coming, and have a blessed day.
Fantastic. Thank you.